presented this as so inevitable. And I think as we hope to become elders and invite the youth to envision themselves as elders one day, how do we reshape the narratives to have hope so that they don't feel a loss of hope with environment, which we're already seeing on the earth. Okay. So sorry, so reading the chat, Michael, you can hear us now? I'm sorry, who is speaking? Um, So, may I interrupt for a minute because I think uh, can we continue with Hilding's? He was interrupted for a second time today. He was also interrupted during his talk earlier. So could we continue? Are those in the room able to hear us? We can hear you online, but can
Yep.
those, we can hear you. Okay, so we can go back to Hilding. And Hilding, please continue. Gratitude, and I'm so sorry.
Oh, thank you. And no worries. Like, as far as I'm concerned, if technology doesn't glitch, there's probably something more wrong. But I think as I was trying to say before, was the power of language is inherent because indigenous languages like my own Mi'kmaq or others talk about objects being animate or inanimate. People, rocks, trees are animate. That means they're living. Yet in English, when we talk about space, it is a dead rock. It is a dead vacuum. It is empty. It is completely inviolable to life, which is also coming back in astronomy because I've been following and working alongside a lot of people around astrobiology recently. And the discussion of what is life is a huge problem in astrology. In the West, we don't even have a good definition for it. But for indigenous peoples, life is more than DNA and RNA. It's our grandmother moon or grandfather moon, depending on your nation. It is the sun, it is the stars, it's the planets, it is space. Life is everywhere. And so I think if our language follows more this uh, animate discussion, as opposed to treating it as dead, lifeless, empty, then we would have a greater respect for it. Because, and I think we purposely define space as empty so that we can ethically exploit it. And that's nothing different than 500 years ago when people came from Europe and declared that indigenous peoples were not human. That was part of the dehumanization and delifeization of people. So I think in the long term, language is where we're going to go. And as Aparna reminded me earlier, was the mining treaty for outer space assumes everything is dead, that there is no life. We don't even know that's true on Mars yet. So what does it mean when we go to Mars and then we find something that everyone agrees is life? Are we going to declare it dead so that we can scrape resources or not? How are we going to talk about these things? So I think back to the original question was the narrative is born by the fact that our choice of how we view these objects in space as lifeless or as life giving or as life itself. And that's very important. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn, but I'd like to keep it brief. And also to everyone in the in-person audience, uh, after some quiet, we ended up starting a conversation online just among the Zoom participants. So I'd like to hand it back to the other lovely panelists in just a moment. but I want to amplify a lot of what's been said so far, which is the power of language and of narrative. And it might seem like those in industry are unaware of all that, but of course they are. If they weren't, they wouldn't be shaping the narrative so consciously into terms around colonialism, frontier, manifest destiny, which is very damaging. But they understand the power of storytelling and of narratives. They wouldn't be buying up entire communication platforms if they didn't. So I just want to emphasize the power of language. It is often the first thing to be taken away from a people. And I also want to emphasize again this relational approach that many of our panelists have shared already with space, viewing space as an ancestor, either as an astrophysicist or just as a human being. And trying to not view it as inanimate and to bring that view back into current law, to bring it back. So, as Hilding has already amplified, there is this blind spot in the Asteroid Mining Act of 2015. It does not extend to environments that could have biological life. So, we need legal policy clarity on this aspect. And given mining's disastrous record on Earth, particularly with Indigenous communities, we need to be asking these questions. And if this is going to unfold this way, what economic benefit can we bring back for everyone on Earth, including those already in treaty with the countries going out into space? So I want to hand it back to our panelists, especially our Indigenous panelists, to comment on the mining and the language and these blind spots and economic benefits.
Not particularly, but I'll give it a shot. It's hard to communicate with industry. I had the privilege of visiting Alvin in April and it's participating in Boston Space Week, where there were a lot of industry people, and they cheerlead hard, and they have no sense. I shouldn't say they have no sense. They have no interest in a dialogue. Many of them. They see, I think they see themselves as ethical. That space is the way, and that for the last 50 odd years since von Braun's manuscript on Mars, us colonizing Mars, there's this moral authority in going to space. And I think it's not really that we should be communicating with them. I think we should be bringing them to communities. It's one thing for me to come to a conference and talk about indigenous methods, but I think it's a whole other thing to sit and silently in a circle around elders talking about their needs their hopes, their connections to the sky, whether it's going north and hearing from Inuit elders about how the sky moved or the stars appear to have moved, whether it is going to South America and hearing about dark constellations, whether it is about going to Australia and hearing about dreaming and so on. And I think listening to the communities themselves who have a knowledge, who have a wisdom that goes beyond astronomers and ourselves as people with completely vested interests in the space industry, that they have a voice that is directly going to the people who are going to make these impacts. And I think that would be a huge step forward. I personally I don't see much point in myself communicating with many of the space actors in the industry because I come from a vested interest. It's easy to dismiss someone who wants to use a telescope on the ground. And as far as I'm concerned, but Indigenous peoples with inherent rights in their communities who need both the support of the space industry, who need access to the space industry, who need access to the sky. I think that is a more important voice to uplift and put forward.
I'd like to echo again Hilding's sentiments about it. It's one thing for me to come to a conference and share these ways of thinking, but the commitment, the real change has to come to those moments of gratitude and appreciation of one another and for Mother Earth and Father Sky. Like coming out in the community and being in community in a way where you're sitting on the grass, looking up at the night sky and discussing, with the real impacts around you, discussing what the future and the hopes can be. And unusually enough, after many conversations that I personally had with a lot of SpaceX engineers, Blue Origin engineers, a lot of them younger, and even OneWeb and people at NASA and many different companies, is that a lot of the engineers and scientists, they do care. They do want to do things better. They do want to become an engineer in tuned and in harmony with not just the environment here on Mother Earth, but to also begin to think about Father Sky and all the stars and the asteroids and Grandmother Moon in the same way. It may not speak like that, but there is that understanding of wanting to do better when going to space. But it seems as though there's a lot of fear, understandably, as a person that's an engineer working in a team and working under somebody, is that there's a power dynamic to be able to be navigated there. And it prevents a lot of these conversations from reaching these upper echelons of influence and power in these companies, because a lot of them are very top down, from my understanding. But if we are to ask these companies to make good on their verbiage, their mission statements, their promises of providing better and equitable access to the stars, and to do it in a better way, and to be able to be in a better way of engineering mindsets as well, to broaden that scope, is I think it can be done. And I think it's a matter of, I've had experience trying to reach out to those individuals, both at various different levels within the industry, to try to understand what their feelings are, and to also offer what I think I can do, or what I can offer in terms of, thinking or motivation to be able to have those moments of silence, as Hilding says, of sitting together and understanding. I think a lot of times, like, you have to speak some other language and understand how those companies work to be able to navigate those situations. But it is always in the service of ke and kinship. And there are times when you can't mince words with them. And you have to be honest and tell them how hurtful their actions are. Now, will they listen? I don't know. But the other thing too, I will say, is that within these companies, that there are Indigenous people that work there too. And a lot of them are beginning to understand and build a coalition of this type of traditional understanding within those companies, beginning with tribal liaison positions, beginning with these understandings that, oh, these companies should have a vested interest in our communities, and building those relationships as a beginning step. So I'm hopeful, but I think there are a lot of challenges in being able to come together with these industry leaders, especially, and begin to understand and kind of understand in a way where we're coming together around these concepts of kinship from our indigenous perspective, our shared lifeways, and from those companies' lifeways, them investing all that energy into those methodologies and methods. So I think there are a lot of good ways we can share and not be exploitative. And I think a lot of companies can definitely begin with at least beginning to try to understand how to build a respectful relationship. But, if NASA can do it, if Blue Origin can kind of begin to do it, if all these other companies can at least understand the importance of it, they just have to look around at all the other companies doing it. Is that there's a lot of potential for building respectful partnerships. So I won't be too pessimistic about it, but I will be hopeful in what we can do in the future.
Thank you.
Aspect of this discussion, right? And the fact that even though we hear speaking in English, the way to interact with the public is in different languages, right? If you want to reach out to the public, you have to speak their language. It's something that we're acutely aware of in terms of public outreach. So the international nature of the work we have to do at the IAUCPS, I think, is crucial, and that's certainly something I'm very interested in terms of communications and outreach, and to see how we reach out and engage with all of those communities around the world. It's not easy. It's time consuming, but we have mechanisms to do that. And I think it's really important that we do to get all of these different perspectives. One thing I found interesting is, I work in the UK. I'm French-Australian of Spanish descent. I work with people from 23 nationalities. We interact with communities, indigenous communities in Australia and South Africa. So there's different perspectives of the night sky, for example. But what I really found interesting this morning is in a couple of stories that were shared, there were very close similarities with some of the storytelling in South Africa in terms of the trickster and launching the stones into the sky. In South Africa, it's launching the ashes of a fire into the sky to create the Milky Way. So I just find it really interesting that we have, when we go and engage with different communities, there are differences, but we also find these incredible similarities and this commonality. And I think that also helps to build, relationship. So maybe a long-winded answer, but yes, absolutely, international engagement in different languages as far and wide as we can is absolutely crucial.
Any of our online panelists want to respond to that question? What do you have? I'm sorry, did I miss something?
that in my mind. And I've seen this a lot in Indigenous communities in Canada, where people will go in to talk to them and try to invite them into a discussion, but they're going in with what they want and a plan already in hand. And so the point for them to go to those communities is to get basically sponsorship or to get a permission for something. So when we talk about being more inclusive, I think we should be opening up is how are we as a CPS, as an organization, or the International Astronomical Union, going to support the needs and the wants of those peoples in these countries, whether it is in African countries, Middle Eastern countries, South American countries, etc. We need to be working more on supporting their needs as opposed to supporting what it is we're advocating for first. So them first, us second.
I'll just add briefly to that, Hilding, and great points. Beginning a journey with the outcomes already known is problematic and doesn't harness one of our greatest strengths, which is our adaptability. If we already know what we want from something, it doesn't leave room for us to be surprised. And I'll just respectfully add to that by saying we have related to the skies as not just scientists, but as storytellers, artists, and much more. So inviting many more disciplines into this advocacy. Have people write plays, curate museum exhibits, and write about this, as many are already. And also to meet many developing nations where their hopes are, that joining this advocacy, joining this ethical relational journey to space, how will we meet them in their greatest concerns, which are economic opportunities, access to education and clean water, and just benefits for their community? How will we bring this back for them so that it's not very focused on outcomes for very particular countries alone?
Okay, so we're kind of running low on time here. We're going to try to wrap up in like the next 5 minutes or so. I'd like to open it up to the in-person audience. Does anyone in person here have a question? Someone in the front row? Is there a microphone, or do I need to run it down to you?
A day of very interesting, stimulating talks. I have a question for Lisa Ruth Rand. Professor Rand, thank you so much for your presentation on Project Westford. I'm not an expert in it, but I really like how you're trying to tell that story as an analogy to like the SpaceX or the Starlink story or the mega constellation satellite communication story. How I would explain it as an analogy is, the best analogy is like a group of scientists just hypothesized that something could possibly work in low Earth orbit, and there wasn't rules saying no, so they went ahead and tried to do it, but then other people found out about it and essentially thought about the long-term implications of it. And that's the best way that I would analogize it, because I'm not an expert in that story, and say, like, remind you of something that's happening today. Like that's how I would phrase it as an analogy to paint it and apply it to today. But as an expert, what is your best, like, quick analogy of how Westford applies and the short summary of it?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Chris. I first want to note one place where the analogy is not quite complete is this. Actually speaks to something that Juan Carlos mentioned earlier in this session, which is that this conversation started as almost more like a co-creative process. This happened before Westford launched, right? This discussion of what could happen. There was a desire among those who were designing this program, and I don't want to give them, I don't want to make a judgment statement on what their morality or their intentions were, right? But they did reach out first, before launching Westford, to talk to the stakeholders that they identified as potentially being interested, right? And that is that is not something that seems to be quite as, you all can maybe speak to this better, but that is not something that is happening in quite the same way with quite the same level of comprehensiveness in our current moment. As far as kind of, are you just to kind of clarify in terms of how can that analogy guide our discussion about the current moment? Great. Well, I think that you know, it is hard for me. It has been driven into me as a historian that I'm not to be prescriptive. I'm there to provide the context, and those of you and who have the knowledge and the skills are the ones who are to come up with the policy and the plans for what to do next. It's very tempting for me too. It's a constant impulse that I'm constraining. But I think that that was one of the reasons why I brought up the question at the very end, which I rushed through a little bit for the purposes of time, which was the fact that that necessary coalition between these experts, these communities of astronomers, and an educated general populace, right, in many ways created a coalition that was effective, that ended up leading to the Department of Defense making changes to this payload that would respect astronomers' desires, right? And part of that is also because it was a publicly funded program versus these privately funded programs, something else that I mentioned, right? But so, but the question becomes, right, is, this feels strange to say to a group of astronomers, but what is your morals, like where is your, what is your standing, right, with these sort of general, this is such a broad sweeping statement, with the general educated populace, right, whatever that means, is there that same moral authority? You still have that same political capital that astronomers once had during this time period, for better or for worse, right, because as I mentioned earlier, right, that this is the debates, the controversies over Westford and Starlink, to use the most prominent example, are almost rhetorically identical. This idea of a dangerous precedent, of graffiti in space, of littering the cosmos, they're the same words, right? So what are the differences between the two? There's a lot of different places where I can see that analogy breaking down, but what to do with that is the big question that I do not feel qualified to say, but one that I think is worth discussing and seeing what we might find to draw from that historical. Again, it's not history repeating itself, but it's history rhyming, right? And what can we take from that rhyme? Sorry, I don't have a pat answer for you, but.
Let's maybe take one more question. Do we have any online questions? Okay, let's do an online one for our last one.
Okay, this is from Eduardo under Sanzana, and I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly. I'll skip the intro, but basically he says, this cultural environment of including indigenous communities in environmental impact studies, this cultural environment is easy to visualize in the case of localized operations such as mining, but what's the cultural environment of a global operation such as the one of a constellation of communication satellites?
Did any of our online panelists want to respond to that?
I love it. So can you repeat the question just a little bit? I don't think I heard all the words. I can't read it, sorry.
I'll read it. This cultural environment is easy to visualize in the case of a localized operation such as mining, but what's the cultural environment of a global operation such as one of a constellation of communication satellites? So it's to do with, we think of cultural environments as being, one culture of a set of indigenous peoples here or another culture there. But now we're talking about something more globally. What's the culture globally?
Yeah, okay, great. I just want to make sure I understood. So globally, wow, that's a big question because we were just talking with my brother here about African traditions and protocols and talking about, Turtle Island and the protocols there and Australia and so forth. To actually bring it all together and attempt to create a common thread would be very difficult. And I'm not sure that private industry would be investing in that. It would have to be academia or, governments that are interested really truly in assuring that everyone's represented. But then you have changes of politicians and you have, cabinets change and on and on. So then people are motivated by different things. I guess, when I think about this, this is something that, I believe the reason my brother Alvin asked me to speak is because have been fully focused on an intertribal conversation where we're focused on First Nations, Native Americans, Indigenous Mexicans, right, and so forth, just all the way around in Turtle Island. And then from there, we can start to exchange knowledge. We can start to exchange goods. We can develop a certain type of economy that's indigenous. What I mean by that is like traditional medicines that don't really exist anymore outside of reservations because of satellite, towers or cell towers and all this other infrastructure. So the only way we can get our own medicines is through borrowing and actually bartering within our own communities. So that's been a big challenge for us. It's a big question as far as broadband access. We're all looking into this in different ways, like, can we use white space? UHF, VHF's white space and such. We're looking at different ways that we can connect. But how do you create a protocol or a culture within a context like that? It would take a long time, and it would take a significant amount of political astuteness and diplomacy. Something that, right now we don't have, something that we're still working on because the governments have given us such strict guidelines on what we can and can't do. Some tribes are casino, gaming tribes, some are not. Some can have industry or businesses, some cannot. So we're a mishmash of treaties and access and rights. And that's really the key is like, when are our treaties going to be respected? When are they going to actually be applied? That's the key. We don't have the kind of lawyers that governments have where they can say, well, we actually meant this, but we said that. So the best I can do is that we need to come together. I see this as an opportunity with your knowledge, building those relationships, and then talking beyond satellites and saying, have you thought about this? You realize if you let them put a cell tower there, they're going to have an easement. Then they're going to come into your reservation and trample all of that medicine that you exchange. Sometimes we need that kind of knowledge and that kind of experience. So there's no clear answer, but I hope that gave you something.
So we're going to try to finish up here because we're running a little late. So just to everybody in person, if you have further questions for our panelists, they will be here. Juan Carlos will be leaving tomorrow, so if you have a question for him, ask him tonight. Does anybody have any other announcements before we go to the next thing? Okay, I think we're doing the lightning poster thing, or Federico will talk. So thank you, everybody.
Hilding, Alvin, it was great to be with you
Thanks a lot.
and
All right.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I invite you to